Hello, hello, everybody. We are so happy to see you all. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you. We'll wait for a little bit more for more folks to join us. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you join us from. My name's Diane. I'm here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live number 8 in our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of our accelerator program that lasts 4 months. As an opportunity for the MedTech Innovator Accelerator companies across our 3 cohorts to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. For those joining us on the live stream, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator for medical devices, healthcare IT, and diagnostics in the world. And we're a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but people with companies that are up and running, that have teams, prototypes, early evidence that the technology works. And then we partner them with experts in the industry, strategics, and others to help them bring their product to market as quickly and as efficiently as possible with as much value as possible. And we're opening these webinars up, the first hour of these webinars, to a live stream audience so that the broader ecosystem, startups all over the world, can join us. So if you're on the live stream on YouTube or LinkedIn, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and our team will make sure to feed them to me, and we'll try to get to them on this live stream. Cohort companies, please stay on for the Q&A for the last 30 minutes after we drop off our live stream audience. With that, it's a real pleasure to talk reimbursement and how to approach payers, public and private, today. We've got great panelists, and I will give them an opportunity to introduce themselves in a second. We're so glad you're here. Welcome. I will first give Laura Manning-Hill an opportunity to introduce herself. She's Director of Digital Health Solutions at Commonwealth Care Alliance, and then hand it to Louis Mattison, who is founder at Mattison Advisory. Last, certainly not least, I will hand the microphone to Gabby Niederauer, who is CEO and founder of Bluegrass Vascular Technologies. She is a founder of a company that went through the MedTech Innovator Accelerator in 2021. So she's bringing the founder perspective to the table. But right back to Laura. Laura, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work before I hand it over to Louis?
Thank you so much, Diane. It's really a pleasure to be here with this panel. I'm just excited to share my journey and hear from the other panelists as well about their journey. I've spent the last 25 plus years of my career in the healthcare tech space, predominantly in the Boston area, but have spanned work in a startup, work in a large integrated delivery network here in the Boston area, worked for a national health service delivery provider, as well as my current employer, Commonwealth Care Alliance, which is a payvider growing nationally, but well established in the Boston markets for the dually eligible Medicare, Medicaid recipients. Over that period of time, I've seen a tremendous growth in the healthcare tech sector. I remember the first electronic health record deployments. I remember Epic as when it was a very small, privately held EHR company, not the multi-billion-dollar entity that it is today. I remember work in the hospital setting where physicians still wrote orders by hand on paper medical records. Over the last few decades, I've experienced meaningful use in the HITECH Act and its impact on healthcare delivery and the tech sector, as well as I've worked for a device company as well, and really have seen, most recently with COVID, the virtual care establishing its position here in the markets, and the consumerization of healthcare, and now moving on to new opportunities like the digital front door, or expanding communications directly with consumers. And I'm happy to pass it on to Louis.
Great. Amazing background. I wish I went first. But there's some interesting common ties here. Where you've done a lot of work with HHS and the meaningful use and all those. I was in my career, I was on the, if I break my career down into three pieces that I think have relevance to the conversation. The first would be, I was a senior advisor in the first National Coordinator's Office for Health IT, established by President Bush to promote the widespread adoption of EMRs. My boss, the undersecretary, would tell others that I'm his chief of staff, but I've always been nervous to use that term in front of my peers because they would never say I was chief of anything with them. But nonetheless, it was a wonderful time. Some very, very accomplished people came out of that group, and it was just fabulous. I followed the undersecretary out and helped him launch a private equity firm that he did, and he also launched a very significant collaboration arm in the industry called Health Evolution Summit. So I was a part of helping him think those through as an advisor. Subsequent to that, the payer side is where I dove in next. And I went to Anthem to be part of the innovation team. And what they wanted was kind of a venture capital-like approach to how you looked at many investments and tried to figure out which ones and why. Eventually, we rebranded as Future Ventures because all of our investments had to make money. The fun one we did that was so hard, but so obvious to everybody on this webinar, we brought virtual visits to Anthem. And today it would be an easy stroke of a check, what's good, what can we afford, let's just get it done. But it was hard back in that day. But it was exciting to collaborate with an entrepreneurial company where we knew something was there and they were patient and we did it. And so I stress that because I was on the buy side, but wanting to get something done. The other lens that will be helpful here is I've been collaborating with a lot of companies in growth mode for the last 9 years. And I collaborate with them around how they go to market and pick the right potential customers, partners, typically partners, and then engage in the conversations that result in very successful long-term partnerships. So I've seen many aspects of how these partnerships happen, as pitching, as buying. And the one thing that you'll hear me iterate on this is simple messages. If it makes sense to you, but you're not sure if the other people really understand what you're saying, they might not understand exactly what you mean by the words you use. And I'll reinforce that point as we go, because I've had several successful partnerships where I'm really good friends with the people we did the deals with. And they've been very clear that the reason we did the deals was we had the patience and we kept on trying to talk in the partner's terms. So they understood their terms where the value was.
Thanks for that, Louis. Gabby, I'll hand the microphone to you. I really appreciate you being here. We'll go into the specifics of reimbursement in a minute, but tell us a little bit about yourself and Bluegrass.
Sure. So my invitation to be on this panel came from the part that I was I was sitting in one of your seats a couple of years ago at being part of the MedTech Innovator cohort. And my background is as a serial entrepreneur. Most recently, I was CEO and president of a company called Bluegrass Vascular Technology. It was acquired in May this year. And what was unique about our product is that it went through a de novo classification process with FDA, and there was no appropriate coding that would cover this surgical procedure in an outpatient hospital setting. So we had to apply for a new tech APC application code to get a brand new HCPCS code. And so what I want to contribute today to these discussions is the importance of a reimbursement strategy and how that process and that journey occurred for our company, and some of the tips and tricks that I learned along the way.
I appreciate that. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. Perhaps let's start just big picture. The hard thing that every startup in healthcare broadly has to balance is clinical benefit and economic benefit. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about reimbursement in general. And so maybe I'll start with you, Laura. How does one balance clinical benefit and economic benefit? And I'll invite the other panelists to jump in wherever appropriate.
Sure. Thank you, Diane. I have to say, over the span of my career, I've found that the factors that go into that kind of decision making vary tremendously by the organization. And just to give you an insight into the type of variability, one organization I worked for was very driven by compliance and contractual obligations. That was first and foremost and the primary driver for exploring any type of technology solution or innovation. Another was very invested in innovation as it impacted their reputation. So reputationally, they wanted to retain that notion of being cutting edge, leading edge, and that was critically important, far beyond business case or ROI. I think most organizations are sort of probably middle of the road and look thoughtfully at a variety of factors, which include business case and ROI, compliance and contractual obligations, as well as reputation. But I find that there's a spectrum there that that organizations fall on.
Reputation as an additional factor. I can appreciate that. So that brings in different factors, right? And it talks about business models. It's making the case for something. I'd love to, Louis, you specifically in your introduction mentioned that one of your areas of work are brokering partnerships, and brokering, perhaps negotiating partnerships is a better way of putting it. But that very often speaks directly to business model. So are there, could you share some examples of successful partnerships or pilots and what makes them successful?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I don't use the term negotiating or brokering, but I understand why the verbs exist. But when you do it well, it doesn't feel like that. So the first one of the things here is understanding how the partner, the payer, the provider, whoever it is you're trying to get in front, understand how they are going to do better. What metric really matters to them. And just putting simple dollars on the table doesn't always do it. Sometimes it does. But it's really important to be thinking as empathetically as you can. What is it that person, the decision maker there that you're talking to, and the stakeholders who can say no are interested in? And when the conversation works well, and you're not just pitching, you're taking a moment to pause, they're playing back a little bit about the words you used in their own words, and then you're talking about the pain point that matters to them, then you know that the ROI that you're talking about matters. But it's important to have your own sense of, what I like to do is have a sense of what it means to their population. Whenever possible, like if you've got a health plan and you can show what the per member per month cost savings are on a population of 10,000, right? You say, if you do this, this is what we expect to see. Now just think about how many members you have. And that's kind of the ROI that I love to talk about. and they will have questions, right? Because they should disbelieve you a little bit. They should get excited and then begin disbelieving by saying, how does that work? And when they start that conversation, that's what's great. The other aspect of really listening to them is, what other problem are you solving? And it could be some aspect of net promoter score if they measure that, because that might show up in their CAPS scores or in their HEDIS star, et cetera, whatever their pain point is. And so listen for that. And it sounds so obvious, but we only have 30 minutes sometimes with a potential partner. And as one of my collaborators once said, when we went a little bit over, and he got every word in, and I said, you know, you don't know what they think. He said, well, it was my time. And you know, that's something that I think we want to be really, really careful on. In the subsequent conversations, that's one of the things I really like to do. One way I love to illustrate it, when you're doing the per member per month savings or whatever else analysis you want to do, I love trying to quantify based on national data sets, because you can't. So there are these out there, and you can show what this might look like for any population. And when you show it can be done, then you can say to the partner, why don't you apply this to your own population, not just the size of members, but maybe your cost structure is different. Maybe some aspect of your cohorts have a higher propensity for whatever problem you're solving. Maybe it's chronic kidney disease, maybe it's heart failure or whatever, but they can apply that to their populations. And so I think that's a really important thing to always be doing.
All right, is there anything that you'd like to add to that in terms of examples or so? A no is a fine answer. One of the things I wanted to make sure to harken back to is, Gabby, in your introduction, you mentioned start early, start very early. And so how did you start to identify your reimbursement challenges? And so what advice can you offer to early stage companies in the beginning of their reimbursement journey?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reimbursement process, at least what it was for us, is a very, very complex process. And you can try, certainly as CEO, to learn as much as you possibly can. But I found finding, you know, subject matter experts or attorneys or consultants that have gone through this process many times and engaging their services is really the best way to go. We also were very active in, because we had to do a IDE clinical study to support our de novo. We made it a point to actually meet with CMS before we started that IDE study and outline to the CMS team, hey, this is the study we're going to do. This is what FDA wants to see as far as outcomes. Are there any other outcomes you want us to collect during that study that would help you or would influence or affect, I guess, the packet of data that we're going to present to you? And it turned out they said, no, what you're collecting is fine, but it's engaging with them early too and trying to educate them on our technology. And I just wanted a little footnote. Our product is used by interventional radiologists, vascular surgeon. It helps place catheters in the right internal jugular. The reviewers, the medical reviewers on the CMS team that looked at our new tech APC were a sinus surgeon and a psychologist. So remember that you won't necessarily have somebody at CMS that is truly an expert in your technology. And so you need to make sure you educate them in a way that they, you know, can understand it and translate it to their processes.
And perhaps just as a follow-up to that, did you right from the get-go assume that you were going to work with public payers? Did you assume public and private payers? How did you make that choice? And how early?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I failed to mention that the patient population that benefited from the use of our device were largely dialysis patient. And for those of you that don't know, typically a dialysis patient will end up going on Medicare within their first year of diagnosis. So for us, it was really foremost is to get that code that Medicare can then approve and grant. So we didn't get to the stage of working with the payers and the insurers at this point yet, because it was pretty much a Medicare type of plan that would cover these patients.
I would say that brings me pretty much immediately to the question of data. Where and how do people get the type of data to understand really what the reimbursement paths look like for their particular device? I'm happy to have any of you jump in on how did you find the data, or how would you advise startups to go about finding the relevant data for their reimbursement path? Louis, I see you're off mute, so I'll call on you first.
I'll start on this one. I wanted to give pause if anyone else wanted to jump in. The point I made earlier, and this relates to some of the folks I've seen do this successfully, and there's different data sets for different questions, but the one that I've loved is when people try to use national data sets to show what the size of the problem is with the patient or membership population they're trying to solve for. If you can show what the typical cost trajectory is, if you have analogs, or even whatever your thesis is for how you're going to change that, that becomes a meaningful conversation. And there are many different data sets you can use. I've worked with an actuary that has subscriptions to a whole bunch of them, and it's almost like a card game where he says pick a card, any card, and we've used we've done some very successful stuff on the Medicare data sets, and it's just great because you're coming in there and not just saying this is the ROI you kind of maybe should want to expect. You're actually showing them on a very representative population the size of the challenge that you want to solve. That is probably the most important piece. Even if it's just propensity, even if it's just the cost during a spiked acute episode, or the ongoing costs year over year, whatever your thesis is, I think those data sets are really, really important ones to come back to, because it shows them that since they have a whole bunch of claims data, and some of them have the EMR data, it shows that they can answer this question for their own population when you're serious enough to get to that next level of discussion.
Louis, can I follow up on that real quick and ask,
yes,
especially for some of the international companies, how does one find that data? What do I even Google to find that? And that may seem a really pedestrian question for you because you've been in the field for a hot minute, but how does one find CMS data?
So it doesn't Google well. It Googles well in the sense that you get many, many, many results, none of which actually answer the question. That's why it does not Google well. But there are organizations out there that will be able to access those sets. I would start typically, I can't promote one over another, but I would start with an actuary. And if you have an actuary that talks through the types of sets they would use, whether you engage them or not, they should be happy talking about that, because that is the basis for how you're going to quantify something. So sometimes that's a great starting point. Probably talk to a couple of actuarial firms, but if you find the one that you really, really feel great with, they're going to have the subscription, so you don't have to buy the data set. That's the way I would typically prefer to look at it. It'll feel expensive in the moment, but not nearly as expensive as paying whatever it takes to buy one of these very, very, very large sets that is also being sold to very large life sciences companies who have the money, resources, and ability to subscribe at very large dollars, because they're looking at the real world evidence around it, and they're doing so many uses that they can come back to this well over and over and over for many, many different questions.
Appreciate that. So I know that at least some of the MedTech Innovator companies are crafting a path that have patients pay out of pocket first as an initial go-to-market strategy, and that will buy us time to coverage. And Laura, I don't know if you can comment on that, or if any of the other panelists want to comment on that. Is that a reasonable go-to-market strategy? Have you seen that work for anyone? Start with out of pocket, then get coverage and reimbursement going. I'll go to Gabby next on that one after Laura.
Sure. I have not seen that specifically. I can just comment more broadly that I think we'll continue to see innovation in the healthcare delivery space where consumers of healthcare, whether you call them patients, members, or consumers, are marketed to directly without intermediaries like employers. And I think we'll start to see more of that in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is the question you're asking about having the patient pay for their own service is really so dependent on the type of product that it is. So Bluegrass's product, was in an outpatient surgical setting used there, and it was, cost more than $5,000, and it was probably not going to be feasible for a patient to pay that for themselves. But I have seen, for example, some technology in the ENT space that, is used more in an office setting where it is, affordable, if you want to use that word. But it was a product that could alleviate perhaps having to do more extensive surgery and could get the same outcome. And in that setting, I have seen other companies that do this type of product where they were able to get the patient to pay for it as they're working through a reimbursement. So I think you really have to look at the technology and where the point of care is to answer that one.
Yep. Diane, can I weigh in with a view here as well?
Of course.
So I agree with that. That makes sense. I think where if you don't have a payer, a large scale payer or large scale channel partner lined up, if your funding supports it, and if you're confident that you're going to create some type of momentum and proof points with customer use, you find a way to do it. And by example, there's a company that I've just been a really big fan of watching, and they're kind of let me join some of their conversations with a Blue plan, and I got to keep it confidential because otherwise I can't tell you how they did it. But they ended up not worrying about getting paid everything that they needed to cover their costs. Their ask was, if we come in and solve this problem that we've actually heard you talking about, it was actually, it was known that this plan cared about this a lot. They said, can we come in and just take whatever small amount makes sense? And will you track the claims? Will you track this and let us prove that this thing will in fact increase the quality of life for your members, and it will also drive down the long-term cost of care. And what I loved about that is they and their investors were okay coming in and use it and just solving a problem, not negotiating over trying to get every dollar before we really knew how it was going to work. And everybody was excited and they're off to the races. And so the more you can get in terms of validation, the better it is. The balance is you always have to balance. If you have investors, someone eventually will say, okay, you've proven to me that you can sell free work. Now you need to sell work at the price point that's in your models. And so you'll have that back and forth. but there's so much value if you can show the outcomes that are going to matter to the channel partner you're trying to work with. And sometimes it'll be stronger customer attachments. You know, some may really value that you're creating a real big lift on how their customers perceive them, getting their NPS scores up. They probably don't a lot of healthcare companies don't measure it, but let's use that as a proxy for really happy people. And that'll translate to the other things that are going to hit their caps and stars, right? So just trying to figure out the different things that will matter to them and then being able to prove those. And then I'll give another example is there's an organization who I'm watching right now. I've just been friends with the CEO for years, and they've got something that's worked really, really well on the consumer side. And they've got enough consumers to say people use it. We can talk about adoption. Adoption and engagement are sometimes really important for consumer-facing devices and or solutions. So they've got a bit of that proof point. And now what they want to do is similarly partner with a health plan and say, can we show that when we engage at this level with these families, especially when they have X or Y chronic conditions, we know from the studies that the cost of care goes down and the quality goes dramatically up. Now they just want to take the consumer validation and say, what happens if we do it at scale and break down all the barriers? And so these are examples where the consumer traction and validation can go a long way, especially if you're trying to get into the value-based arena and say, we want to measure our success.
Thanks for jumping in there. I might take this point and broaden it to, you know, what you described is an early stage pilot, right? And with at first the goal not necessarily to make money, but test out a hypothesis. And so perhaps to all three of you, and given that you just gave that example, I'll ask Laura and Gabby to weigh in. What should be the goal of an early stage pilot program? And so you touched on some things, right? But is it business model validation? Is it clinical efficacy? What should the goal of a pilot be? And how do we articulate that as we're starting that conversation about a pilot?
Sure. Diane, I'll take a stab. I think all the things that you listed are critical elements to evaluating a proof of concept or a pilot. One of the factors that we're just now introducing, and I'm starting to see in as a factor in piloting in the healthcare delivery and payer side is the voice of the customer. So now we're introducing the customer as a critical stakeholder in pilot and POC evaluation and bringing them into weigh in addition to those traditional components like business case validation, acceptance, clinical and quality impact, all those standard features. That's a new one that I'm starting to see.
Appreciate that. Anything to add to that, Gabby?
Not really. Again, my experiences are a lot different. You know, for us, you know, the pilot portion of our journey was really more on the clinical side and doing a certain number of cases and looking at the clinical efficacy and the outcomes, because most of the new tech APC process is really looking at you know, what are the clinical benefits, because you're not really comparing it to anything else, because in our situation de novo, it's a totally novel product, so you have less of that comparison.
Got it.
Can I just add a variation? This is, since I'm from Washington, D.C., this will sound like a very Washingtonian answer, and it's going to go back to yours, Gabby. It varies, it depends. And so in some instances, you're trying to validate something as part of the model. But really what you're trying to do is get a foot in the door, because if they really like it, then you can scale it, right? If you have say you have a large health plan, this is always the ideal. And if they're in multiple states, or even in a single state, if they're just larger beyond the pilot, What you're really looking for is success so that that dance partner will bring you to other places where they dance. It could be a county and a big state, and then you want to go broader. It could be success with a large national in Georgia, and then they love it. And then whoever runs that region says, I want to bring this to the next one. Or the medical officers are saying, this thing works, let's go. So sometimes it's just a foot in the door. Other times you are actually trying to prove the model, but sometimes you're proving the model, and those are the words you use to get the foot in the door. And then you're having the ongoing conversation. It's almost like expensive BD, business development, by doing the work. The other type of pilot that you'll see is if someone won't commit to something long-term, but they will give you the fair rate that you have in your spread and your models, right? If I get 10 channel partners, this is the revenue expect, this is the price point, you can still get those in a pilot. And sometimes a health plan or a payer will use the term pilot so that they're not committing beyond this. It allows them to do a 1-year agreement and not a 5-year agreement or a 3-year or whatever. But if you succeed, you get the other markets. And so the pilots can do so many different things. And Gabby, your thoughts here got me even thinking about there's, you can do comparative things on a population, right? The whole body of real world evidence is to look at what happens when say physicians have a choice between one thing and another. Is there a way to compare that? It doesn't have to be as fancy as a pragmatic clinical trial, but you can try to compare against cohorts where it's used and not used. So the goals of a pilot should vary based on what you want to do. But what you really want to do is get a customer starting to really get excited about you and have an ongoing dialogue about how and why it works. That's the real outcome.
I would say that's one we can all agree on.
Yep.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So pilots bring up the topic of stakeholders, right? Who are all the different stakeholders? And for different startups, and actually for everybody, there are different stakeholders in the mix. And so one of the stakeholders that are perhaps less intuitive to some startups are charities, patient groups, lobbying groups. I would be interested in your opinions on how to engage the relevant stakeholders, especially what I would call the non-obvious one. The stakeholder you're trying to sell to is the one who's obvious to you. But this healthcare is a complex field. How do you find out who the stakeholders are and how do you engage them? Gabby, I saw you go off mute, so I'll have you go first.
Yeah, and this was something as I was preparing for this panel, trying to remember all the contributors on our process. And I think a very important stakeholder, especially for medical devices, are the specialty medical societies. So, for example, I mentioned our product could be used by an interventional radiologist, could be used by a vascular surgeon, could be used by interventional nephrologist. So each of those specialties have their own medical society that has a coding and reimbursement committee. And at some point, you need to educate them on what your product is and make sure that they can advocate for you or understand your product or jump in with you. So you might have to make some choices on which one might be the best one. And you can also involve them in some of the discussions with CMS as you're going through, for example, an application review. But the other important part of that is that if you also need to get a new CPT code, which is the procedural payment for doing the service that's provided, right? The physician payment part, that has to go from the medical society to the American Medical Association, the AMA, and it cannot be submitted by a company. It has to go that route. And so you have to really make sure, as I mentioned at the start, engage with them, understand that process, and how can they help you get the HCPCS or CPT or whatever codes you need to have to support your product.
I'm looking at the other two to see if there's anything that you'd like to add or elaborate on. Laura.
I would add, Diane, that I've seen the American Telemedicine Association, a professional organization, as Gabby mentioned, they're important stakeholders, really be instrumental in pushing forward with CMS advocacy for codes for optimizing reimbursement in the virtual visit space.
Thanks for that. And Laura, you mentioned in your introduction that you're with a payvider, which is a unique business model. There's a couple of them in the States, but it makes approaching you specifically or more broadly approaching Commonwealth Care Alliance different from approaching a pure payer. I'd love to hear your view on some of the differences and some of the things that an organization like yours might be looking for.
Sure. I think a good question to ask a candidate partner, whether they're payer, provider, or payvider, is to learn more about their internal governance structure and how they're structured internally for making decisions about new technologies. I find that insight can help to create a strategy for how one develops a collaboration. In our preliminary discussion prior to going online, Lewis had mentioned that just approaching the CEO with a flashy deck and getting a card doesn't always seal the deal. And that's been my experience as well, that these are very, very complex organizations. An enormous swath of stakeholders need to be engaged and committed and on board for solutioning to move forward. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to take a lot of time to get the engagement and get that collaboration going. And in our early preliminary discussions, Diane, in preparation for this webinar, I had talked about the importance of timeline and understanding your potential candidate partners' budget timeline process when they're, because there are certain time frames where openness to introducing new capital budget asks might be more palatable than other times, and that's an important step in the sequence, is lining those asks once commitments and collaboration and consensus has been formed into a time frame that makes sense for your candidate partner.
And perhaps just as a quick follow-up, to your best knowledge, do folks have the same timelines or different timelines? And so should everything be said and done by January 1st? Are we talking mid-year?
Yeah.
I'd love to get an idea as to how things work where you are, but also more broadly, if that's exemplary of the rest of the industry.
No, I'd say they're very different timelines. Some organizations have a calendar year that aligns with a fiscal year. Some have a fiscal year that kicks off September 1, and then very different timeframes in terms of when, but on internal budget deadlines. So any kind of exposure, transparency that is offered would be important to take into consideration.
So I think I'll ask the other two panelists the same question. Lewis, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's so much variation, and that's why just as an expression one of my mentors would call hanging around the hoop. He was a former CMS CMO. but you know, you always talked about hanging around the hoop. And the importance there is, as soon as the issue is hot with the right persons, with the right people, you know, you get to move, and you have to move fast as you can. But other times it takes a long time. You've got these unwieldy organizations, whether it's a payvider, whether it's a provider, or whether it's a payer. And so it's just a matter of, there's a lot of stamina. When it takes more than a year, now you're banking on no reorganizations, or did you have a reorganization and now you're starting over with a new chief medical officer or a new medical director focused on the area, who truly does have thought leadership. Now the question is, who has the decision rights ultimately? And so it's really important to have stamina, try to have many different touch points in the organization. And these touch points give you situational awareness. So sometimes someone can tell you there's a real budget crunch, just sit low. You know, I had someone the other day, several months back, tell me that there was this one organization and they weren't going to take any more meetings till the end of February. They said, but don't worry, it's not you. They're just going to get something done, and they're not taking any meetings. End of February, I heard from my colleague that everything was back on track. And so it takes a lot of conversations. And so every person you know at these organizations really matters, because they can kind of give you the temperature.
That's helpful. Gabby.
Yeah, so my timeline experiences were primarily with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it covered the new tech APC application. And let me just preface it that we received our de novo clearance in February of 2020, filed at the end of February our new tech APC application. And as we all recall, in March of 2020, the whole country shut down because of the pandemic. So I know that there was an extraordinary amount of burden on all of our healthcare systems and governmental agency. Typically, a new tech APC is reviewed in 90 days. And we had some additional questions and some, issues raised. And so it went beyond the 90 days and essentially went into a period where there's not as much accountability on a timeline of review. We ended up having to wait 19 months on something that supposedly takes 90 days. And it was compared to, in our process, to the FDA, a lot less transparency, a lot less, goals to make certain timeline reviews like they have at MEDUFA for FDA. And so I would just urge all the startup companies is give yourself extra time, because you can only push so much. And at some point, it's just going to take time, and you got to, give yourself buffer to do that. Otherwise, if you run out of money and you can't get to that extra period of time, it's not a good thing.
Thanks for that. Perhaps one of the things that that many startups struggle with is too strong of a word, but pay attention to is pricing strategy. It is very hard to really nail pricing strategy, revenue model, reimbursement model. And so I'd love to have you comment on, is it better to narrow one's initial target market, for specific reimbursement codes, or a fee for service? Is there a first mover advantage to getting CMS reimbursement? I might start with you, Louis, and see if the other two panelists would like to comment. But how does one navigate the business model and pricing strategy?
Yeah, it's so complicated, but I'll just try to touch on a few different ways there. One is fee for service versus value based is going to be entirely different. There are some. I know one person who moved out of regular contracting for a health plan and into what they were calling payer provider collaboration, the operating word being collaboration. And he said, I never want to do another fee for service agreement again. And, you know, it's a hard negotiation over unit cost. And, you know, a lot of people don't like it on either side, and it's hard. On the value-based side, when you get to an organization that wants to do value-based types of arrangements, where the compensation comes out of the savings that you can quantify and demonstrate, that gets pretty exciting. And sometimes they're not hard dollars. Sometimes you might have metrics that are proxies for what the savings are. Other times they are hard dollars. And there are many different types of those. So you'll have fee for service, you know, with a fee schedule. You can have case rates, bundled payments, and sometimes, you know, everything that happens within that bundle is, you know, it's the decision of the providers on what are they going to use, where are they going to operate, what are they going to insert, et cetera. Then you get to population-based risk, and you'll have some organizations that'll go to the farthest extreme and take full global risk, where they'll say to the health plan, hey, as the provider, just give me the bulk of the medical costs that you would have paid anyway, and I'm going to be on the hook from there. At that point, they're the decision makers because they're the risk buyers. And so there are so many different ways that the you know, reimbursement plays out. Back to an earlier question, you said, you know, is it clinical efficacy or is it, you know, cost effectiveness? And those are two very different things, because some of the great innovations are not about reducing the cost of care. They're there because we can. They're there because we're solving problems that really we want to go away. It could be a type of cancer. It could be something with Alzheimer's. It could be something that's a real breakthrough. And I think society wants to pay for that. I know it does. Then there are the other routine innovations where, not routine innovations, the value-based models push toward what a dear colleague of mine, Lee Balesson, said, is the innovation is around routinizing the best practices in care. And so there you're trying to do all of the things that, you know, when you do these, it drives down costs. And so, you know, it's going to be important to know which of those we're in. Are we transforming something? And it is about quality of life and other things that are really not asking how much does it cost, because it's something that is really an improvement. And the others are going to be around cost of care. So those are so many different ways to think about it. I strongly advise people, and I'll pause here because this feels long, but there's so much in it. If there are many different ways you can go, try to have the conversation starting around one so that people can ground around it. But as they talk about where their pain point is, expand it. If you want to start in Medicare Advantage with complex patients or with a certain type of surgery or with something else, but someone says, you know, my real problem is Medicaid, switch to Medicaid. Talk to their Medicaid people about how it works. If they're not open to fee for service, but they want value-based, find a way to get that in. And so you start with what you think it is and can be, just to narrow the conversation, because people don't do well when you can serve everybody and solve everything.
Appreciate that. I see the other two panelists nodding. Happy to have you weigh in. Otherwise, I think I am looking at the time, and time does fly when we're having fun. And so I want to give you an opportunity before we bid our online audience goodbye and go into private Q&A with the companies. Any final thoughts, bits of advice that you would, reflecting on this conversation or on your work in general, things that haven't come up in the conversation that you would like to leave our online audience with?
I'll just give you my 2 cents worth, having been in the medical device industry for almost 30 years now. You know, the big barrier to entry used to be getting your FDA approval clearance. And I think that has shifted in the last 10 years or so, that reimbursement is absolutely critical. So I urge each and every one of you, engage early, think about it, find experts and work with them, because you can't learn it all. It's just too complicated, in my opinion, to become an expert. Find the people who are and engage with them.
Laura, any advice for the audience? It's a hard one. You know what? We cannot hear you. I am so sorry. You are on mute. I'll go to Louis first, and we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'll stress the relationship piece, listening and learning. And it sounds so obvious, but it's really hard. And so, you know, the more payer, and I'm taking a payer bent here, the more payer or other purchaser decisions you can have, even well before you're ready, just forging the relationships, even on an informal basis, so that you can start to understand what is important to them. You can understand how they think about it. You can also understand who do you need to talk to. So the more you can create these touch points, even before you need them, and then continue the conversations, the better. And then the other point I really would like to emphasize is try to test whether they really understand what it is you're saying and what it is you do. You know, when you've got really smart CEOs who started these companies, and they're spending a lot of time, you don't know if the person on the other end of the phone, who's either your door opener or the decision maker, really gets the simplest version of why what you have is awesome. And you just want to make sure that they understand it. You hear it in their terms, then you know. And I think it's always wise just to, if you haven't heard them say it back to you, kind of doubt whether they do. It's a safe thing to do, to just want to make sure you've heard it. So just keeping it simple and in their terms is good, and having the relationship that goes long before the meetings that you really need is great.
Appreciate those thoughts for the startups. We may be experiencing a little bit of sound issues, and so I think I will just take this moment to thank our three panelists. We've got Laura Manning-Hill, Louis Mattison, and Gabby Niederauer. Thanks for being here today. We will bid our online audience goodbye. We will be talking about safety and security next week. So please come back next week. We're looking forward to having you. And with that, we will stop.